The oldest gospel ends at an empty tomb. No appearances, no risen Jesus, no resurrection. The women find the stone rolled away. A young man in white robes tells them that Jesus has risen and has gone ahead to Galilee, and they should tell the disciples. And then the gospel ends with these words, "And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." That is it. That is where the oldest manuscript of the oldest gospel stops. No Jesus walking through walls. No breakfast of fish on the beach. No commission to go into all the world and preach the gospel. No ascension. Nothing. An empty tomb. A message that went undelivered. And fear. And before I tell you what Spinoza found in the documents that explains why those 12 verses the ones that changed everything, the ones that founded 2,000 years of global mission. Before I tell you what the evidence shows about when they were written and by whom, I need you to understand something about what is not there. Because the absence is the argument. The absence is the evidence. Most people who encounter this for the first time assume it must be a matter of dispute. A handful of scholars arguing on the margins about a few contested verses. They assume the church has addressed it, has an answer, that the question has been settled in some way they simply were not told about. It has not been settled. There is no answer. There is only a silence that has been maintained for 17 centuries by institutions that knew exactly what the oldest manuscripts contained and chose, year after year, to continue reading those 12 added verses as if they were original. In a few minutes, I'm going to show you the one verse in those 12 that funded 2,000 years of global mission and tell you exactly how it came to be written. But first, let us look at the document itself. The Gospel of Mark is the oldest gospel we have. That is the consensus of every serious New Testament scholar working today, and it has been the consensus since the 19th century. Scholarly agreement places its composition around 70 years after the Common Era, decades before Matthew and Luke were written. This matters because of something called Markan priority, one of the most thoroughly established findings in biblical scholarship. The authors of Matthew and Luke used Mark as a primary source. Matthew reproduces approximately 90% of Mark's material. Luke reproduces approximately 50%. The vocabulary, the sequence, the very phrasing in long stretches of text. They align in ways that cannot be coincidental. They were copying. If the ending of Mark was added by a later hand, then Matthew and Luke were not drawing on an independent tradition confirming physical resurrection appearances. They were elaborating on a base text that already lacked that ending. The entire chain of resurrection narratives in the canonical Gospels would be built on a foundation that may not have existed in the oldest layer of the tradition. But here is where it gets uncomfortable. The two oldest manuscripts of the New Testament that we possess agree with each other on this point, in a way that leaves very little room for alternative interpretation. The Codex Sinaiticus is a manuscript produced somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean in the region of 330 to 360 years after the Common Era. It is not a fragment, it is a complete New Testament, handwritten, one of the great monuments of early Christian manuscript culture, housed in the British Library. The Codex Vaticanus, roughly contemporary, produced in the 4th century, is housed in Rome, in the Vatican Library. These are the two oldest and most authoritative complete Greek New Testament manuscripts in existence. Both of them end the Gospel of Mark at chapter 16, verse 8. And what I am about to tell you about the Sinaiticus cannot be read past quickly, because it is not just an absence of text. It is something more deliberate than an absence. I want to tell you about the afternoon I first saw it for myself. This would have been the late 1980s, early 90s. I had been working for some years on a project in textual criticism, the kind of slow, painstaking work that requires you to sit with facsimiles of ancient manuscripts for long hours, word by word, line by line. I had requested facsimile materials of the Sinaiticus through the interlibrary system, which in those days meant waiting weeks and working in a specific reading room allocated for manuscript consultation. The room was small, cold, the way English reading rooms are always cold regardless of the season, with a particular quality of preserved institutional chill that no amount of heating ever quite addresses. Long wooden tables, good light, and the kind of silence that is not quite silence, the soft turning of pages, the occasional scratch of a pencil. I turned to the page of Mark 16. And there, after verse 8, after the women fled and were afraid and said nothing to anyone, was a space, not the end of a column and the beginning of a new text, not a natural terminus, a space, a deliberate gap left in the parchment, as if the scribe who made this copy had reached the end of what his exemplar contained, had recognized that something was missing, and had left room, hoping that someone would come after him with the words that should fill it. That detail does not appear in most popular discussions of this question. The absence of the ending in the Sinaiticus is widely known. The space left by the scribe is less often mentioned, but it matters because it tells us something about what the scribe knew. He was not copying a text he believed was complete. He was copying a text he believed was incomplete, and the empty space is a 4-century-old acknowledgement that the original ending had already been lost, or had never existed, and that no one had yet agreed on what should replace it. What I felt sitting with that facsimile in that cold reading room was not the excitement of discovery. It was quieter than that, a particular kind of loneliness that comes from looking directly at an absence, not reading about it in a textbook, not hearing a colleague describe it, seeing it. The texture of the gap in the parchment, the empty column after the last word of verse 8, the silence of a scribe who knew something was wrong and had no way to fix it. That is the physical evidence, and the physical evidence alone should be enough to establish the question. But what I am about to tell you about the internal evidence, the evidence within the text of those 12 verses themselves, makes the physical evidence look almost secondary by comparison. What I have not yet told you cannot be unheard. So if you want to close this now, before the full picture, I understand. But I think you should stay. The 12th verse is known as the longer ending of Mark, chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, contain 18 words that do not appear anywhere else in the Gospel of Mark. 18 words in 12 verses. Words that Mark, across 15 chapters and hundreds of verses, never once used. Textual critics have a method for assessing this. When a passage uses vocabulary at a substantially higher rate than the rest of a known author's work, that is a flag, a signal, something that demands explanation. The Nestle-Aland critical text, the standard scholarly edition used by seminary students and researchers worldwide, marks those verses with a bracket indicating textual uncertainty. Not out of caution, because the evidence demands the bracket, but the vocabulary is only the first problem. There is a structural break in the Greek itself that no competent editor would have left standing. Verse 8 ends with the women as the grammatical subject. They fled. They said nothing. They were afraid. Verse 9 introduces Jesus as the new grammatical subject, without transition, without connective, without the narrative tissue that any writer would use to bridge two different focal points. Read it in Greek, and you feel the seam immediately. It is not a continuous narrative. It is two separate texts placed against each other, and the join does not close. Whoever added those verses created a visible scar in the text, and that scar has been sitting in the pages of the Bible for 17 centuries. And that is when I realized, but before I tell you what it means for Matthew and Luke, I need to show you something the church fathers themselves wrote down. Eusebius of Caesarea, writing in the early 4th century, the same man who was intimately involved in the politics of early canon formation and who had access to manuscript traditions from across the Christian world, wrote explicitly that the longer ending of Mark was absent from, in his words, nearly all the copies of the Gospel according to Mark. Eusebius did not write this as a protest. He wrote it as a matter of established fact, the way you describe the weather. Nearly all the manuscripts he knew ended at verse 8. Jerome, writing later in the 4th century, the scholar responsible for the Latin Vulgate, the translation that became the official Bible of the Western Church for over a millennium, said essentially the same thing. He knew that most of the Greek manuscripts he had access to did not contain the longer ending. He knew it was disputed. He recorded that knowledge. And then the church he served continued to read those 12 verses from every pulpit, as if Eusebius and Jerome had never written a word. These are not modern scholars with a bias or an agenda. These are the men who assembled the Christian canon. If they knew the longer ending was absent from nearly all the Greek manuscripts, then every bishop and scholar who came after them knew it too. The knowledge did not disappear. It was managed. There is a difference between a secret and managed knowledge, and this was always the latter. So perhaps it was simply lost. Perhaps the original ending of Mark was damaged, destroyed in a fire, lost in a shipwreck, separated from the manuscript during a period of persecution. That is what I told myself for a long time. It is the most charitable explanation, the one that does not require anyone to have done anything deliberate. But then I found something in the manuscript tradition that made that explanation very difficult to maintain. There are not one but 4 different endings of Mark in the manuscript record. 4. The ending most people know, chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, with the Great Commission and the speaking in tongues and the handling of serpents, is called the longer ending. It is the one that made it into most printed Bibles, but it is not the only one. There is also what scholars call the shorter ending, a brief paragraph found in some Latin and Syriac manuscripts, which follows verse 8 and reads approximately, "They reported briefly to those around Peter all that they had been told. And after this, Jesus himself sent out through them, from east to west, the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation." It appears in manuscripts from North Africa and the Middle East, in a tradition separate from the longer ending. There is the Phreologian, found only in the Codex Washingtonianus, a manuscript produced in the late 4th or early 5th century, now in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. The Phreologian is an insertion between verse 14 and verse 15, containing a conversation between the risen Jesus and his disciples about why they did not believe the resurrection reports. It is the most elaborate of the variants, the most theologically developed, and almost certainly the latest in date. And there is the intermediate ending, which appears in certain manuscripts combining elements from the shorter and longer traditions. 4 versions, 4 attempts to complete a gospel that did not have a completion. The logic of what this means together is the part that I want you to think through carefully, because it is simple, but its implications do not stay contained. If there had been an original ending, a genuine concluding section of the Gospel of Mark that was later lost or separated from the rest, you would expect the manuscript tradition to converge toward that ending as it was rediscovered or reconstructed. You would expect a dominant tradition with minor variations. You would not expect 4 substantively different endings, developed in different geographical regions, in different manuscript traditions, in different languages, at different times. The 4 endings are not 4 imperfect copies of one original ending. They are 4 independent attempts to supply an ending that was never there. Each community that encountered Mark without a resurrection conclusion felt the absence and tried to fill it. They filled it differently because there was no original to copy. The variety is the proof that the tradition was empty at its end. Bart Ehrman, the New Testament scholar whose textual analysis I find consistently rigorous, has been direct about this. The longer ending of Mark is almost certainly not an original part of the gospel. That is not a fringe position. Conservative evangelical textual critics and secular historical critics both look at the evidence and arrive at the same place. The longer ending was added. The question has only ever been when, and by whom, and why. The when is approximately the late 1st to early 2nd century. The first scholar who explicitly quotes from the longer ending is Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 years after the Common Era, which gives us an upper boundary. The longer ending existed by 180 years after the Common Era. It did not exist in the Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, produced 2 centuries after that, which suggests it was already a known variant, but not universally accepted. The why is where Spinoza's method becomes essential, and the why is what I want to warn you about now. Because once you see the institutional logic of the addition, the implications do not stay inside the Gospel of Mark. They travel. Spinoza never analyzed the Gospel of Mark directly. The specific question of Mark 16 did not appear in the shape it now appears to us until 19th and 20th century textual criticism had done its work. But what he established in his great work of 1670 applies to this passage with a precision that is almost uncomfortable. The method is this. When you examine a text for authenticity, you apply 3 criteria. Does the passage use the same vocabulary and style as the rest of the work? Does it cohere internally with the author's known habits of thought? And does its presence serve the literary needs of the text or the institutional needs of those who transmitted the text? If a passage fails the first two criteria and passes the third, Spinoza's framework identifies it as an institutional insertion. Mark 16, verses 9 through 20, fails the first two criteria completely. It uses vocabulary that Mark does not use. It breaks the grammatical continuity of Mark's own text, and it passes the third criterion spectacularly because its presence serves institutional needs in ways that are precise and historically traceable. I want to tell you about the evening I first understood the connection. I'd been working through Spinoza's 1670 text in preparation for a lecture on biblical methodology. This was in Norwich, my study, a lamp at the edge of the desk, the rest of the house quiet. It was late, the kind of late that happens when you are working through something that keeps opening rather than closing. I had been reading the chapter where Spinoza sets out his criteria for identifying passages inserted by later hands, how you distinguish the original intention of an author from the institutional renovation of a scribe. I was working through the criteria one by one, and somewhere in that process I realized that I was reading a description of something I had spent years studying from the other side. I had been looking at Mark 16 from the textual criticism end, asking what the manuscripts showed. Spinoza was showing me the methodological framework that explains why what the manuscripts show makes sense. The criteria matched not as a discovery, but as a recognition. The way you recognize the shape of something you have seen in different light. What stayed with me that evening was not triumph. It was discomfort. The discomfort of a gear clicking into a place where, if you think about it long enough, you realize you wish it had not clicked. Because the gear in question is this: the longer ending of Mark was not added by accident, and it was not added by a scribe trying to preserve a lost tradition. It was added by a second-century church community that needed Mark to say something that the original Mark did not say. And what did they need it to say? The second century was the period when the institutional church was fighting its most consequential theological battle. The Gnostic movements had developed sophisticated theologies of spiritual resurrection. For Gnostic Christians, the resurrection of Jesus was a spiritual event, not a matter of a physical body walking out of a tomb. Resurrection, for the Gnostics, was about liberation from the physical, not reaffirmation of it. The movement that would define mainstream Christianity needed the resurrection to be physical, visible, documented, witnessed. And the oldest gospel they had ended at an empty tomb with women who told no one. That was not a foundation for a doctrine of bodily resurrection against powerful theological opposition. The longer ending gives them precisely what they needed: physical appearances, the risen Jesus speaking to multiple witnesses, a commission extending the authority of those witnesses forward into the institutional church. Every element of the longer ending is exactly what the second-century church required to win that argument. Spinoza also identified the pattern of retroactive institutional projection, the tendency of scribes and later editors to insert passages that resolve theological ambiguities that became uncomfortable after the original text was composed. A Mark without physical resurrection was theologically dangerous in the second century. The insertion of 12 verses resolved the danger. It gave the institutional church a document it needed. Now, I have to be honest with you about what this means for the rest of the New Testament, because the implications do not stay contained to Mark. Stay with me to the end, because the last thing I want to say is not about manuscripts or Greek vocabulary. It is about what you do with a faith that was partly built on additions. Matthew and Luke copied Mark. That is established. When they came to write their resurrection narratives, they were working from Mark as a primary source. If their copy already contained the longer ending, they had a template. If it did not, they had to build their appearance narratives on other foundations. What you find when you compare the resurrection accounts in Matthew, Luke, and John is not what you would expect from independent witnesses confirming a historical event. Independent witnesses tend to agree on the main structural facts and diverge on peripheral details. The gospel resurrection narratives do something different. They agree on the large claim that Jesus rose and appeared to his followers, while contradicting each other substantially on who went to the tomb, what they found there, where the appearances happened, and who was present. Matthew adds guards at the tomb, an earthquake, an angel who rolls the stone back. Luke adds the road to Emmaus and Jesus eating fish in Jerusalem. John adds Mary Magdalene weeping in the garden, Thomas putting his hand in the wound. The later the gospel, the more physical and detailed and elaborate the resurrection becomes. That is the wrong direction for genuine historical tradition. Real historical memory loses detail over time. It does not gain it. What gains detail over time is theological narrative, as each generation adds what its theological needs require. The trajectory from Mark's empty tomb through Matthew's earthquake and Luke's road to Emmaus and John's extended physical encounters follows precisely the pattern you would expect from a tradition that was being developed to answer a specific theological argument, not preserved from direct memory. The institutional need of the 2nd century was a physical resurrection that could not be spiritualized away, and what the texts show, from Mark's empty ending through to John's deeply physical appearances, is precisely that need being met, generation by generation, in texts written later and later with more and more detail. And now I want to tell you about the Great Commission, because this is the piece that stayed with me longest. This is the one that I first heard mentioned in a corridor between conference sessions, and that I could not dismiss afterwards. I was at an academic conference in the north of England sometime in the mid-1990s, between panels. The coffee at those events is always terrible, thin and slightly burnt, served in small paper cups that are too hot to hold properly. The kind of coffee that you drink not because you want it, but because the act of holding something warm is better than nothing between sessions. A colleague of mine who had spent many years working specifically on the synoptic problem, the question of how Matthew, Luke, and Mark relate to each other textually, said something to me in that corridor that I have thought about many times since. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that every serious textual scholar working in the field knew that chapter 16, verses 9 through 20, were not original to Mark. He said it the way you mentioned the weather, not a revelation. A shared assumption among people who had spent their careers with these documents. And then he said, the real question is not the manuscripts. The real question is why the congregations are not told. He walked away to find better coffee, and I stood in that corridor for a while with what remained in my paper cup going cold. That sentence has stayed with me because it names something more important than any of the textual questions individually. The knowledge is not hidden. It is in the critical apparatus of every serious scholarly edition of the Greek New Testament. It is in the footnotes of your scholarly Bible. Every seminary-trained minister learned about the textual uncertainty of Mark 16 during their training. The institution knows. The library knows. The pew does not know. But here is the piece I mentioned, the verse that I promised you, Mark chapter 16, verse 15. What the church calls the Great Commission. The verse read, at mission ordinations, at the founding of religious orders, at the consecration of cathedrals built on every inhabited continent. The verse that is possibly more directly responsible for the global shape of Christianity than any other single sentence in the New Testament. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. According to every serious scholarly edition of the Greek New Testament, according to the textual record, according to 2 centuries of manuscript evidence, that verse is part of the longer ending. It is part of the addition. The verse that founded the global mission of the Christian church, the verse read over the heads of men and women being sent to the ends of the earth, the verse that propelled 2,000 years of missionary activity across every culture on the planet, was written by a 2nd century scribe, trying to provide the oldest gospel with an ending it did not have. That is not a fringe position. That is what the critical apparatus says. That is what the footnotes in your scholarly Bible say. That is what Eusebius knew, and Jerome knew, and every serious textual scholar since the 19th century has known. The knowledge exists. It is simply managed. It does not move from the library to the pew, and that decision is an institutional one, made by institutions with very specific reasons for maintaining certain narratives. And I want to be very careful here about how I say what I need to say next, because this is not simple. This is where the question stops being about manuscripts. You might think this collapses everything. That was my first instinct too. But Spinoza had a different response, and it is more honest than either naive belief or easy dismissal. What I find when I sit with this evidence, as I have done many times in that small study in Norwich with the lamp on and the tea going cold, is something that is simultaneously a clarification and a loss. The clarification is real. You cannot unknow what the manuscripts say. You cannot unknow that Eusebius and Jerome knew. You cannot unknow that the Great Commission is part of an edition. That clarity has value, and it is hard-won. But the loss is also real, not the loss of faith in a total sense. What was taken from me by the evidence is the certainty that the text arrived intact, the certainty that the words I read are the words that were written. That particular certainty I no longer have. And this is where Spinoza becomes essential, because what he understood is that these are not the same question. The question of whether the resurrection is spiritually real, whether it names something true about transformation and the refusal of the worst to have the final word, is not the same question as whether 12 verses were added by a second-century scribe. Spinoza was not trying to destroy faith. In the very work where he established the methodology for identifying textual insertions, he distinguished between the spiritual meaning of a religious tradition and the historical claims made on behalf of that tradition by its institutional managers. A tradition can carry genuine spiritual truth even when the specific historical claims made in its name turn out to be more complicated than the institutions presented them. The spiritual question and the historical question are not the same question, and conflating them causes damage in both directions. Faith built on a foundation that cannot withstand examination is fragile in a way that eventually fails the people who depend on it. Faith that has looked clearly at the empty column after verse 8 in the Sinaiticus, at the 4 different endings, at the seam in the Greek text where one hand stopped and another began, that faith is not the same faith it was before, but it may be stronger for having survived the looking. The question I want to leave you with is not whether Jesus rose from the dead. The manuscript evidence cannot resolve that and was never designed to. The question is this: the document that contains that claim was edited by human hands in the late 1st or early 2nd century for reasons that are historically traceable. We know roughly who made the change, when, and why. What does honesty require you to do with it? I've spent most of my adult life trying to answer that question for myself. I'm not certain it has made me happier. I'm certain it has made me more honest. And in the long run, I believe that matters more than comfort, built on something that is no longer standing. The oldest gospel ends at an empty tomb. The women said nothing, for they were afraid. Whatever came next was written by other hands, in other times, for reasons we can now partly understand. That is the document. That is what we have. And that, I think, is where the honest question begins.
What I shared today, it took me years to accept. Tell me in the comments if this changed something for you. Sometimes the truth is uncomfortable, but it's still the truth.